Hello, Internet. Gino, that Penguino Grieco here again with another episode of Deep Listens, and today's a very special episode. It's time to discuss the Final Fantasy trading card game. You might remember this game as the winner of our Best Mechanic, or Best New Mechanic of 2018 award for breaking cards and discarding cards to create CP. That was a contentious category in our Game of the Years, but I just felt like I needed to know more about this game. I've been getting into it more, and I'm not in any way an expert on the game, so I figured it might be nice to explain. We've got a lot of people who are interested in Final Fantasy. We've got some Magic the Gathering stuff, so might as well talk about a game that blends the two, and this time we'll be discussing it with someone who actually knows what they're talking about, unlike me and unlike Chris Zombie Pie Redacted, who got us into this mess. But hey, we're here now, and now we're going to make up for lost time and learn a little bit about this game. So I am joined, as always, by M. Palladino. Hello, resident game designer.
Hello. Happy to be here. Thanks for letting me do this show with you guys. I'm really interested to talk about FF TCG because I have a lot of thoughts about it, but we'll get there.
And I am also excited to be joined by Adam Lane of the RVA Returners, a very popular YouTube channel. So you can find their YouTube channel on RVA Returners on YouTube. But also, you're a tournament organizer. You're an FF TCG player. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, we kind of do a little bit of everything. So I play, we run tournaments, do content, podcasts, all that stuff.
Excellent. Yeah, so that's actually how I found you. I was starting to get into the game a little bit more, trying to learn about it, trying to figure out what decks were good and how people were playing, and I stumbled across FF TCG Decks, which is a site that aggregates content and has a little bit of a search function, because unlike Magic the Gathering, like all of the searching of cards and looking up and doing research, it's not all standardized at like one hub that Square runs like Wizards does. Wizards runs a search engine to find cards, and that's how I usually come up with decks. But all of that stuff seems to be homegrown. And FF TCG Decks is one of the sites that does content aggregation and deck building stuff. And your content came up all the time. And of the content that I was watching to try and learn more about the game and figure stuff out, I found that yours was definitely the most well-produced and also most accurate, I found, compared to the results that I was seeing across other tournaments. So it was good to it helped me learn a whole lot. So I'm super excited to have you on.
Thanks. Yeah, that means a lot, actually. We work with FF Decks a lot. And yeah, you'll find a lot of stuff for this game, at least right now, is pretty grassroots. Square definitely runs their big stuff, but there's definitely a lot of community ran events and a lot of the sites and the content right now are very community ran. So
yeah, it makes sense. So how did you get into this game? How did you get in touch with the game, build your community, and get your site up and your Twitch and all that stuff up and running?
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a long story. So I come from a different card game called Versus System. You might not have ever even heard of it.
I have heard of it because any site that I'm looking for FFTCG stuff, they have a Versus section as well.
Yeah, so that was a card game based around the Marvel and DC IPs. It plays way different than this or Magic. Final Fantasy is more akin to Magic than anything else. But yeah, I mean, I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, have been for a very long time. When I get into card games, I tend to like the IP really gets me in. And so once I quit Versus, I wasn't going to play card games anymore. I was done because it was a lot of money, and you're buying sets every time. So I kind of went over to start playing competitive fighting games. That was more my itch. And then I saw this was coming out. So I was like, okay, I got to buy into this. It's a Final Fantasy card game. I got to at least try it. And there was actually a version in Japan called Chapters. And I remember buying like a starter deck, but all the cards were Japanese. They never were translated over to English. And so it was a pain to even try to learn and play. You had to basically have like a short novel to your on your side to translate all these cards for you while you're playing, so you made sure you're playing right. And it just didn't appeal. But as soon as they started, westernizing the cards and translating it, which they still are kind of trying to get better at. Some cards are kind of translated poorly, and there are erratas and such.
I noticed that everything – so Opus 1 and Opus 2, the first two sets, there were a lot of cards where the language between cards that did similar things would not necessarily even be the same.
Yes. They still do it from time to time, and it is a bit upsetting. But they're definitely trying to right the ship, and they're getting better at it. It's still not quite as big over here as it is in like Europe and Japan, but our scene is growing, and this year I think is going to be a kind of a breakout year. It's getting bigger like every week, which is great, and the game is really great too. A lot of Magic players come over and play, and most Magic players that I talk to actually tend to prefer this game just because of there's no real mana screw in this game, and that's the big thing that Magic players hate. And you can have bad hands in Final Fantasy, but because of the discard mechanic that you mentioned earlier, your turn one is you're like, you can't get screwed by not drawing lands. You're always going to at least have something to play. It might not be the most optimal thing, but like at least you feel like you're playing the game still.
Yeah, I have not seen, even in some of the tournaments I've watched, I've not seen stomps the way that happen in Magic, where someone stumbles on one land or something, and then it's a non-game. In the FF TCG, it seems like even if you stumble and even if your opponent's deck is really aggressive, you will at least have a point or two of interaction where you can, try to make a block or try to settle the game down or have a choice about, should I go all in to put down a big forward to try and stem the bleeding, or should I try to just take these licks and set up and try and play a longer game? And you at least have a decision to be made. In Magic, there are plenty of times where in the first 2-3 turns, if things go poorly for you and your opponent is aggressive, the game just ends without you even getting to really play. And you can lose an entire match that way, and I just haven't seen that happen very much.
Yeah, so there was a deck. We recently just had our first couple bans of cards, and there's 7 sets now. The 8th set comes out in March, and of those, everything is standard. There's no like rotation yet. It's all one standard kind of tournament. There are different formats, but every set is legal. And we had our 2 first banned cards, and there was a deck that it might not have necessarily been the best deck, but it made it where you didn't really feel like you were playing Final Fantasy TCG, kind of like it kind of just didn't let your opponent play the game. It was a deck where it went Hellbit turn 1. If you're familiar with that term for Magic, where it kind of just vomited its hand onto the board, and it made you discard 3 cards. So you were already 3 cards back, and you had to deal with like 2 forwards usually and a backup, and then a lot of their summons were either moving blockers out of the way, and they would kill you very, very fast, and you wouldn't even really feel like you even got to play the game. So they did ban 2 cards from that deck, and it kind of made the archetype pretty much irrelevant now. You don't see it anymore.
Okay, but at least that's an all-in sort of strategy.
It was, and you could turn the corner on them, but the problem was there was a monster that got banned. He was really the culprit. His name was Gesper. And every turn, he would make each player discard a card, but the thing was the player that was playing Gesper would use that to his advantage and just empty his hand. So that was really just a one-sided discard effect every turn. And he was so in Final Fantasy, you have a lot of stuff as legendary creatures, right? Like in Magic, if you have a legendary, you can only have one of that creature out. In Final Fantasy, unless it says otherwise, the creature is legendary. So if it has that symbol at the top right, multi-unit symbol, you can have multiples out, and Gesper is one of those cards. So if you got 2 of those out, yeah, you're drawing 2 cards every turn, but Gesper is going to make you discard 2 cards every turn. So you had to be able to play off the top of your deck, and that deck was built to do that, and other decks just weren't. So it was a little unfair.
Well, I'm glad they tamped that down, because that sounds brutally unfun, and that is a lesson that Magic learned a while ago. Like, instant speed discard is rough, and repeat discard effects are also very rough.
Yeah, it was only during your turn, so your opponent still got to attempt to play their cards, but if you didn't already have backups down, and because they made you discard cards early, it would be hard to even get into the game against them, and you had to respond to play forwards out, because unlike Magic, where like if I play 2 1/1s in Magic, right, like you're going to take 2, you don't mind. But in Final Fantasy, if I play 2 1,000 power forwards, they made you discard a card. They're still coming in for 2 damage, and if you get hit for 7 damage in Final Fantasy, you're dead. So there's a trade-off there. Whereas like a rush deck in Magic, they have to kind of play their 1/1, then play their 2/2, right, and keep hitting you in the face. But in Final Fantasy, it doesn't matter if it's like Cloud hitting you or a Viking hitting you, or they're doing the same amount of damage,
Yep. Em, were you trying to ask something?
I was just going to ask what the banned cards were. I know Gesper was one of them. What was the other one?
The other one is Thaumaturge. He's a Final Fantasy 14 standard unit, and all he was a 2 CP forward, and CP is like mana cost. and he came into play and he made your opponent discard a card. And then if your opponent had 2 or less cards in their hand, he got a power boost.
Okay.
Yeah, he was basically just 2 CP, discard a card, and then benefited from when you got their hand size super low, and because your opponent could never stabilize and play bigger spells. So I guess it's worth mentioning, like with the discarding CP, your hand size kind of represents how much mana you have, or CP you have available to you, as well as your backups that are in play. So unless you have a combination of backups and cards in hand, there are certain cards you just cannot play. Like if something costs 7 CP and you can't get any backups into play and you're drawing 2 cards a turn, there's no possible way you could ever cast it.
Right. And, you know, kind of like how in Magic when your opponent passes to you, you have to kind of pay attention how much open mana he has available to him. In Final Fantasy, like if you're tapped out and you have 1 card in your hand, I kind of know that you can't play anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there are things like that, and the rules are very akin to Magic. The stack works exactly the same. There's like almost no difference in the stack. There are differences in phases, though. You know, in Magic, you're allowed to kind of do stuff in the instep, whereas in Final Fantasy, you can do stuff if you pass to your opponent, but if you respond by doing things at the end of your opponent's turn, your opponent gets to play more things. So
Okay.
it kind of just never exits the phase. Whereas like in Magic, if I do stuff during the instep, like once you pass to your end, like you can't go back and then play a creature unless it has flash or something.
Yep. Okay, I didn't know that. So it's like the end step is just the end of a main phase instead of being a separate thing where only instance and instant speed things can happen.
Right. Priority works a little bit differently in Final Fantasy. Like you can't respond to the draw step and you can't respond to the end step, but things do happen there, right? Like the end step is more of like a cleanup phase, and things will resolve there, but you can't add to the stack there, like at all.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So something I just wanted to ask for people who are getting into the game. So Magic has 5 colors, right? Red, blue, white, black, green, and each of them kind of have their identity flavorfully and also their identity mechanically. And then there's kind of artifacts that can be colorless, but those are kind of the parameters of everything within the world of Magic. The Final Fantasy trading card game has 6 kind of normal elements: fire, ice, water, earth, wind, and lightning, and then 2 kind of special elements, light and dark. Do you think you could explain to the listeners like what the flavor and mechanical pie or slice of the mechanics each element represents, and what these special elements are and how they work?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the special elements because they're kind of a weird case. So like you said earlier, you're able to discard for CP and spend that on cards to play. But light and dark cards cannot be discarded for CP unless you have other cards that allow you to do it. And then once they're out on the field, you're only allowed to have 1 light or 1 dark card out on the field at a time, again, unless another card allows you to have multiples out, which there are cards that exist. Usually the power level of these cards are higher for their CP cost. They tend to be overcurve, or they have some kind of ability that warrants you to play them in your deck. But you don't want to play a lot of them because they will kind of make your deck clunky. Because you can't discard them, you have to be able to have backups down usually to play them, or you're discarding from your hand directly to play them. And there are some very powerful ones that you do see a lot. But, you know, like typically it's like 3, 4 maybe light or dark cards in a 50-card deck.
Can you have a light and a dark card in play, or if you've got a light, you can't have a dark?
You can't, yeah. If you have a light, you can't have a dark, and if you have a dark, you can't have a light. There are cards, though, that allow you to have multiple darks out. But if you are able to kind of break that card, it'll make your board state illegal, and then you have to kind of kill both of them at that time. That's kind of a weird ruling. Yeah, so they're meant to be like kind of really powerful. But you know, the drawback is that they're usually expensive, and usually like they're not going to produce CP for you. Like they better be doing something good for you. So, and there are light backups and light forwards, as well as light and dark summons too. The other elements though, so they all kind of have their own thing to them. Like they have their identity, right? Ice has discard. It's a big one. Probably one of the stronger mechanics in the game, to be honest. Then they have dulling, which is the same as kind of tapping a creature.
Making it inactive. It can't attack and block.
Yep, and then there's a mechanic that's specific to Final Fantasy called freeze. And there are some stuff in Magic that basically do this. Basically, what freeze is it puts a token on a card, and that card doesn't activate the next active or untap phase. So you can kind of keep stuff locked down. And then the other kind of thing for ice is dealing damage to things that aren't active, things that are dull. That's another one of their identities. Then you have fire. Fire is more about like dealing straight damage to a creature. There aren't a lot of cards in this game that deal straight damage to the opponent. Right now, there are only 2 that exist in the entire game, and they don't just deal damage. They usually have kind of like a thing tied to them that you have to do in order to deal that direct damage to the opponent. But fire does have both those cards. And then haste is a big thing. Fire has a lot of keywords: haste, first strike, and brave. Not so much brave, but they do have cards that do have brave. But haste and first strike are definitely big deals for them. And then, yeah, like I said, like pingy damage, maybe damage that deals damage to the entire board, or just big damage to one target is their kind of identity. And the last couple sets, Fire's definitely been on the weaker end, but that doesn't mean that they don't have good cards. And
I would say Fire is probably the most direct analog to just Red from Magic. They have almost the exact same mechanical identity. The only difference is Fire has Brave, which is attacking, doesn't dull your character. Red does not have that, but everything else is pretty much straight up Red from Magic.
Yeah, and the Brave or Vigilance is what it's called in Magic. It's not super common in Fire, but there are cards that have it. Vigilance is more of like an Earth mechanic, actually. Yeah. A lot of Earth forwards have Brave, and I guess I'll go into Earth there too. Like Earth is more about like your stuff's not dulling when it's attacking. Very big bodies, like huge dudes, more like green, I guess, in Magic, right?
It is the green.
Yeah, it's more like stomping. You want to stomp your opponent out and still have stuff up for defense. They also have a lot of EX bursts, which is a mechanic that's typical to Final Fantasy. So the way EX burst works is when you take a damage in Final Fantasy, you actually take the top card of your deck and you put it in your damage zone. And once it's in that zone, it's gone, like, for the rest of the game. There are no cards that bring that back currently. If the card has a little thing on it that says EX, that means that you get its effect for free if it comes off damage. So Earth has a lot of cards like that where when you flip them, you kind of get to do the effect for free, essentially. And also EX bursts work under split second in Magic, so you can't respond to them.
I didn't know that.
Yep, so once an EX burst comes off the top, it operates on its own separate stack, and it just resolves with no kind of interaction from the player. The player gets to choose, right, like where it goes, but the other player can't try to respond to try to save their guy, really. Like, if it comes off burst and the burst says kill something, it's dead. Like, there's not much you can do about it. So Earth has a lot of access to that. And then, as well as, like, they have... I'm trying to think.
They can get things back from their discard pile, similar to Green from Magic.
They do have a lot of recursion, yep.
That's their card advantage. Instead of drawing a lot of extra cards, they're just going into their graveyard and picking stuff up from there.
Yep. And then, they have a lot of actually, like, kind of they have a lot of tutory stuff, too, where they can, like, search for stuff. Every color has access to tutors, but Earth seems to have these kind of things that kind of tutor for themselves. And then, like you said, like, a lot of recursion. Like, there are a few cards that also, like, kind of come back from the dead as well in Earth. And then Water. Water is really about, like, card draw is a big thing in Water. Water has a ton of cards that draw cards. They also have power reduction, which is probably the best removal in the game. So if you take damage equal to your power, your card breaks, which is just like going to their graveyard. However, if your power is reduced to 0, your card is placed to there. So that gets around stuff that says it can't be broken. So it's kind of like a weird interaction there. So if your power is ever reduced to 0, you just die without breaking, really. Mm-hmm. So Water has access to that. Water also has a lot of, like, return to hand effects, like you can return opponent's stuff to their hand, or you can return your stuff to your hand. And then that's really it for Water. Wind is mostly about reactivating things. So if you're dull, you can kind of activate back up. Wind likes to make a lot of things kind of pseudo-free. Like, you'll have, like, a thing that costs 5 that says you can untap all your backups. So you can basically tap your backups to play it and then untap all your backups. So you essentially spent 0. And then they also have a little bit of discard to them as well. And then a lot of like stuff that can't be targeted, like hexproof, basically.
Yep.
Is their thing. Lightning is a lot of damage to active things, so it's kind of the reverse of ice. So it's about dealing damage to things that are active. It also has a lot of haste as well, and then a lot of like straight breaking effects and some evasive type forwards, like things that are harder to like hit. And then what was the one? I feel like I left one out.
No, you did wind, earth, fire, ice, water, and lightning. So I think we're good.
Okay.
And then the two special ones. But yeah, I think my understanding of it is like wind is a little bit of like white from Magic and green a little bit. It's got a lot of go wide, like make a ton of dudes, do a little bit of pinging. It's got a little bit of hexproof, basically. And things are cheap or free because it's untapping or it's activating all of its backups constantly. Lightning seems a little bit like black. It's got a lot of kill spells and tap haste, a little bit of first strike, a little bit of reduced power, but with a little bit of restrictions around it. Blue and water are very similar. It's got a lot of bounce, a lot of card draw. Earth seems to be very similar to green, like you said. Fire is red. And then ice kind of lives in a middle ground between blue in Magic and black in Magic because it has the discard from black and the dulling from blue.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, yeah.
But I think that there's a lot of balance to the colors. And I think it's, I guess, worth mentioning, like, you mentioned the backups and activating and stuff like that. You're only allowed to have 5 backups at most in play at a time, right? And these are kind of your cards that generate free CP. You know, it's
right.
A reusable resource.
Yeah, and there's a lot of thought that goes into deck building, too, because you can only have 5 out. You want to have backups that can break themselves to do things, usually, to make room for other backups, because if you've already played 5 and they can't break themselves or you have no way to break them, you're locked out of playing your other backups for the rest of the game. And, yeah, backups are kind of like lands in a way, but they cost, right? So usually the higher cost, the more stuff they're going to do. And a lot of like the higher ones that do kind of a big effect, they're usually kind of stuck there, and you have to have maybe another way to get rid of them if you want to. But backups are really a good player is going to play a lot of backups so that they can efficiently spend their CP, right? Because that way they're keeping more cards in hand to have more options while still threatening the board.
Yeah, and I guess it's also worth mentioning it's not like there's a mana pool like there is in Magic where you just float a bunch of mana and then you can divvy it out as you want. When you pay for something, if you float 4 CP and you're playing a 3-cost thing, that 1 CP that's left over, that's just gone, right?
Yep. Yeah, you cannot float CP.
Yeah, so if you don't have a backup and you're trying to play a card that has an odd cost, you are going to be wasting, effectively, 1 CP to play it if you're just discarding from your hand. So backups really are what allow you to play things efficiently, in a literal sense.
Yeah, I'd say most decks you want to get at least 3 backups down, and then any kind of control-y type deck is going to want to be at 4 or 5, like every game.
And I guess that also means, like, there are cards that cost up to 9 CP that I've seen.
Yep.
And because you can only have 5 backups in play, that means that for those cards, you can never play them with just backups. You have to always have at least 2 cards in hand to get them into play. How does that impact gameplay? Like having cards that are so expensive that you can't play them without basically running into card disadvantage.
Yeah, I'd say the big one that you see a lot is Shantoto. She costs 7. She's a board wipe. She removes everything that's on the board. Every forward that's on the board, she removes them from the game. So not just like breaks them, she just straight up, they're gone. And that's kind of a card you have to watch out for if you're playing against any kind of Earth deck, any kind of control shell that has Earth in it, which is a good amount. You have to kind of be expecting her, so you have to know not to overextend. But, you also have to know if they can cast her, right? Like, if they only have 3 backups and they have 2 cards in their hand, they can't possibly play Shantoto. So it just kind of changes your math a little bit. It's more than just looking at just the lands on the board. You have to know, okay, they have X cards in hand. Here's the things that maybe they could cast, and you have to kind of keep that on your mind. And that means, like, there are summons, like, there are really strong summons that cost 5 and 7 CP, and you have to be aware of those because those things will swing games,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've been talking about these different colors and elements and all that sort of stuff. in the FF TCG, you only really need 1 CP of a given element in order to cast a card of that element. So if you're going to play a lightning card, you only need to have 1 lightning CP contributed to that cost in order to play it. But because you're discarding cards, like one of the primary ways you generate CP is by discarding cards of that color or of that element. How does that limit like what kind of deck combinations you make? Like, can you play 3 elements? Can you play 4? Is it possible to play all 6, or are you really limited to 1 or 2?
So I play 3 and 4 color decks a lot, actually. Back in Opus 5, one of the best decks was a 3-color deck. It was extremely powerful. I'd say mono is definitely a good place to start. Like, if you're just starting the game, I would play a mono deck because it's a lot easier. You're not really – it's a lot easier to figure out. What I'm trying to say is the hardest part of playing this game, in my opinion, is knowing what to discard and when to discard it for CP.
Yeah.
Because if you open with a hand and you know your power cards, right? But in Magic, like, you're just like, okay, I need lands to build up to this point so I can play this guy that's going to change the game. But in Final Fantasy, you're like, I need to get backups down so that I can play these guys later. But you're going to see those power cards early sometimes, but you have to know, like, when it's okay to discard those cards to play other cards. Because you know once you discard those cards in certain decks, you're never seeing that again. And then that gets really even more brutal when you have these 1-ofs and stuff that you know you're going to need for like matchups, certain matchups and things like that. And there is no sideboard in Final Fantasy currently. Like, that just doesn't exist. So and it's best of 1 in tournaments right now. So you kind of have to. That's a very, very important part to learn how to play. And so learning that with a mono deck is much easier. However, dual color decks are pretty common. 3-color decks you'll see from time to time, and even 4-color decks. After you get to like 4+ color, though, it gets a little bit janky, I think. Like when you're getting to like 5 and 6. And cards like Sid 2 make it easier to play multicolor decks. Because if people don't know what Sid 2 does is he can dull himself to search your deck for a 1 CP backup of any color. So it kind of color fixes you in that sense.
Yeah, I think at least from reading all the cards that I've read, it seems like if you're going to get up to 4 or 5, there's a handful of – you kind of have to be base earth or base wind, it seems like, or you have to play light or dark backups that make any CP.
Yep, and so earth is definitely – you're going to see that almost, if you're playing like 3 to 4 colors, earth is almost always going to be in there because Shantoto is a board wipe, but she also counts as every element in the game, so she taps for whatever you want. Then there's a dark card called Camlanot that lets you search for any dark card in the game. And what you do is you play him, and then that lets you search for your 2 CP dark backup that taps for any color. And so they're currently light doesn't have a version of that card, so usually if you're playing 3 to 4 colors, you're going to see that dark card as well as earth in some form.
Makes sense. So one thing that I've noticed from playing the game and from watching the game is I think deck archetypes might be a little bit different than what people coming from other games might expect, especially if they're coming from Magic. Would you, like in Magic, you could think of like aggro decks, these decks that are playing very aggressively, playing a lot of cards, very cheap cards, and they're just trying to get their opponent dead very quickly. There are combo decks that kind of center around 1 or 2 or 3 card interactions that once you've assembled the pieces, you just murder your opponent in a way that they can't really interact with. There's control decks that kind of sit back behind resources and just kill all of your things until they get into a position where they've got an insurmountable advantage, and then they kill you. They like to play with their food. There's mid-range that's sort of somewhere in between control and aggro. You know, they're bigger than the aggro decks but smaller than the control decks, and they tend to play these kind of medium games where they are playing things that are very efficient, but they're not committing too much on any given play. And then you can get into other kind of archetypes like tempo, which are trying to just stay 1 turn ahead of you for the entire game until you're dead. But do those kind of archetypes exist? Like, how would you describe the deck types in Final Fantasy?
Yeah, I'd say all those exist, to be honest. They're pretty similar, albeit a little bit different, right? You have your usually mid-range and tempo are kind of interchangeable in Final Fantasy. They kind of refer to the same type of deck. Usually you're playing like dudes. You're always going to be playing dudes that are bigger than their guys, but they're not going to be quite as big as like your control-y decks. Although not necessarily, because power level doesn't necessarily like. So in a control deck, you might be playing smaller dudes that are doing more for you, like controlling the board. Because in Final Fantasy, like I said, it doesn't matter if your power on your card is 8,000 or 1,000. If I attack through for damage, I deal the same amount of damage. And so all the control player really cares about is like, am I killing stuff? And then do I have a way to kill them at the end? Because they're drawing 2 cards a turn, and there's only 50 cards in a deck instead of 60, and your playsets are 3 as well. By the way, that's a lot. That is different from Magic. Games can go to deck. Like, that does happen. So there are decks that can kind of win through damage, but there are decks that will, if they realize they can't beat you through damage, they can mill you out. That they're like Earth Wind is a good example of that. That's maybe the best deck right now as well. And they can kind of slowly just kill you, and once they get a board state set up, they can get to the point where they're removing something essentially for free every turn, and then they'll just slowly kill you once they're set up. But you also have aggro a little bit too. There's fire aggro decks, there's lightning aggro decks, there's fire lightning aggro decks. Aggro, I would say, though, right now isn't in a great place. Turbo, that deck I was talking about earlier with the discard and they kind of vomit their hand out, that was probably the best aggro deck we've ever seen in this game. Like the competitive life cycle, that's probably the best aggro deck we've seen. And I don't think that they like that style of play, really. And so I think they're really careful about printing stuff that do things like that, because in Final Fantasy, you want to get to the point where you're playing your clouds, you're playing your squalls, right? Like, or people aren't going to have fun. And so usually tempo is a lot of what you see. And then control, you'll see that a pretty good amount in competitive events. But I'd say most of the time they fall into tempo, control, or aggro, those kind of 3 archetypes. Sure. There are a few combo-y decks, but I wouldn't say there's... I guess if you want to consider... Some of the control decks are very combo-y. Like, they have a couple cards that work off of each other and then slow... But they don't, like, kind of instantly kill you, like in Magic, where you have this combo that lasts for, like, you know, the player's doing, like, 50 things on the stack and then you die. There's nothing like that, really, in Final Fantasy.
Yeah, it seems like the only cards that can just kind of kill you out of nowhere by themselves are like, what's his name? He's the Final Fantasy IV villain.
Golbez?
Isn't there a Golbez that he kill? If you can break him, he goes and gets you 4 backups of different elements.
Four forwards. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So he's actually he's an aggro archetype that comes and goes, and he is a deck actually that's like 5 colors, which I should have probably mentioned earlier. The problem with Golbez is there's a lot of counters to him. There's a lot of ways to kind of just make him not go off. And if they can't go off, then they kind of just crumble and die. And so there's just there's like a lot of 1 or 2 off cards that will just destroy that archetype. You do see it from time to time, and it's also a deck that plays 0 backups.
Oh, wow.
Which is kind of cool. But a lot of people actually like to start with that card. They see that card. A lot of newer players see that card, and they're like, oh, I'm going to build a deck around that. And it's not bad. But if you play a good player that's seen it before, they can make you cry, kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, and it seems like the combo-y decks are mostly because there's like 1 or 2 cards that have a really weird, unique effect, like Golbez. Isn't there a Titus that can just attack a bunch of times in a turn?
Yeah, he attacks based on the amount of damage you've taken, but it's a special ability, which I also didn't mention either. So. Oh
yeah, why don't we mention specials?
Yeah, so there's abilities in Final Fantasy. You know, you can spend, you know, however much CP's on the card that tells you what it does. Then there's special abilities, which are marked with a special icon. It's like a S, like a red S. And what that means is it requires another copy of that card with the same name. Doesn't have to be the same exact copy. They just have to share the exact name. So you could, for that Titus, for example, his ability is S and 2 water. And then he gains Vigilance or Brave until the end of the turn, and he can attack however many times you've received damage. So effectively up to 6, which can win you a game. I mean, he also gets buffed based on how many forwards you control. So he can get really big, and then he can swing for game. You actually don't see him a lot at competitive play, just because it's really hard to fit. Usually, if you're playing around a special ability, you want to have at least 3 copies of a card. And typically, if it's a special ability that's a win con, you want to usually have more than that. And it's really hard to fit 3 to 4, 5 Tituses in your water deck right now, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's actually something I want to ask Em. As a game developer, what do you think of that as a way to kind of incentivize players to have a lot of cards of, you know, maybe their favorite Final Fantasy character, like Titus or something like that, incentivize you to have a bunch in your deck and still have something to do with it in a game where almost everything's effectively legendary?
Yeah, that's something that I've been like struggling with in my own deck building. Just trying to find this balance of like, if I want to get this special off, I need, you know, another version of this card. I didn't know that it extended to like cards of the same name, so that sort of takes some of the pressure off. But it's very much like if you are interested in getting this ability off, you gotta build around it.
Yeah, I mean, it actually really jumped out at me when I first started playing this game because there was I don't know, Adam, how familiar you are with Magic, but are you aware of the set Future Sight?
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not.
Okay, so it was a set that came out over 10 years ago. It's one of my favorite sets of all time. It's also one of the most broken sets of all time and one of the most ill-advised sets that they ever made because there were, I believe, 60 different mechanics in it. 60 different, like, named mechanics that did different things. They weren't, like, it wasn't an accident. They created a bunch of cards that were literally one-offs that were supposed to be predictions of cards from the future that were pulled into Magic's present. And so every single one of them had a new mechanic on it or something that you'd never seen before. And they made 5 legendary creatures in that set with an ability called Grandeur. And it is just the special ability mechanic from Final Fantasy. If you discarded a card of the same name and then paid the cost, you got this super duper effect on top of, like, kind of like mimicked an effect that they already had.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was one that if you discarded a card with the same name, it just got double power for a turn and stuff like that. And so I thought that was a super cool mechanic, but Wizards, the company that makes Magic, said they'll never do that again because most legendary creatures, there's an entire format called Commander that people get really into, and it's based around legendary creatures, and it's also a singleton format where you're only allowed to have one card of each name, of any given name in your deck. So it's impossible to use Grandeur in Commander, but Grandeur can only be on legendary creatures, which are mostly focused on Commander, or at least have some allegiance to that format. So they just said, yeah, we're not going to do that again, even though it was a, kind of cool mechanic. And then I saw this card game, I'm like, oh, that's Grandeur. And they made, like, it an entire mechanic that really anchors the game. Because if you don't have something like that, it's not as bad as, like, in Magic, because every card in Final Fantasy is essentially a split card between whatever they do, whatever's printed on them, and 2 CP. So it's not as bad as being stuck with a legendary card in your hand, but the specials make it so that you're encouraged to do above. It's not just like a deck building consideration. It's like, I can go all the way in on this card if I want to, and it'll pay me off.
Yeah, and there's also another format called Title format.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask about that. Could you explain Title?
So basically the way Title works is instead of building 50 cards from, all the Opus sets, you have to take 50 cards, and they can be from the Opus sets, but they can only be, all your cards in your 50-card deck have to be from the same game. So it has to be in the little right corner of, your card, it says what title the card is from, so like 7 or 8, 10. And then some titles aren't legal, like Dissidia. You can't play every hero. Yeah, it's not allowed. But so every card has to be from that. And the legend rule only applies to the card number. So I can have 3 clouds out on the board as long as each cloud is a different card. And that kind of incentivizes, too, with the S abilities, the specials. It makes it a lot easier for them to go off. So in Title, a lot of special abilities become even stronger because you're running decks where you got 15 clouds in them and you got, 12 Vincents or 12 Tituses or whatever.
And how do colors work in Title?
So colors only matter when you're spending for abilities. So when you're casting summons or backups or forwards, color is actually irrelevant.
Wow.
That's interesting.
So I guess this is just a question for my edification. If something says you can search for a character of a given title or of a given set, does that include summons, or is that just... So there's 4 card types. There's forwards, backups, monsters, which are kind of weird. They sometimes behave like forwards, sometimes like backups, sometimes they're just effects. And then summons that kind of behave like instants and sorceries from Magic. Are summons characters for the purposes of searching?
No. So characters are forwards, backups, and monsters currently.
Okay, cool.
Summons are kind of their own thing. So there are summon tutors in the game, but Earth has one, and Lightning has a couple. Other than that, they don't really exist. When it says character, it refers to backup, monster, forward, and then most tutors say forward only. Most, not all. There are a few like Setzer from Final Fantasy VI. He searches for a Final Fantasy VI character. So he can legit search for a backup, a monster, or a forward if he wants to.
Steiner, my boy.
Yep, Steiner as well. Yep.
So, in title, how are the sets balanced so far? Like, are there any particular games that are especially good? Please tell me Final Fantasy IX is especially good. And then, are there any sets that it seems like Final Fantasy I is unplayable?
Final Fantasy I is unplayable right now, for sure. It depends on the set, right? It seems like what they've been doing the last few sets, at least, is they'll have a set that's focused on title. Well, every set's focused on standard, right? But then they'll have a set that kind of sub-focuses on title, and then the next set will kind of focus on sealed and limited. And then they'll kind of alternate. So this past set actually was pretty title-focused, you could tell. There were a lot of cards that bumped up. And usually they'll focus on, like, 3 to 4 titles in a set. And usually, if you play title format, you'll see those usually will get a considerable bump. Right now, I wouldn't say 9's that strong.
Damn
but the next set is 9 focused.
Yeah.
So
cool.
if they focus more on title, which I think they are, because I think they're trying to make it more of a competitive format, you'll probably get some cool 9 title cards. Right now, like every Zidane is pretty insane.
Yeah.
But Zidane doesn't have a special ability. He always just kind of does something when he's on the board. Garnet is very strong, but not super strong in title really. And then obviously Steiner's insane. That card is pretty nutty, and even in title and out of title. Right now, I'd say your best bets are to play 10, Final Fantasy 10, Final Fantasy 5, and Final Fantasy 12 are probably the 3 best right now. But there are a lot that are kind of like a rung lower. Like Final Fantasy 7 is pretty good. Final Fantasy Tactics is very strong.
2 seems surprisingly supported as someone who has played 2 recently. It's amazing how many characters they have. I don't know if they're all good, but they've put a lot of Final Fantasy 2 people in the game.
Yeah,
which is interesting.
2 is decent. The problem is you'll notice with some of the categories they don't have a lot of summon support, and 2 is one of them.
Yeah.
But there are strong cards in 2. 2 sees more play in standard, I think, than in title.
Oh, interesting. So one question. Go ahead. Go ahead.
How was Final Fantasy 13?
13's really good, actually. This last set focused on 13. Yeah. Being able to play multiple Lightnings and multiple Sarahs can get pretty stupid. So there's a deck kind of built around. Basically, it's Lightning, Sarah, and Snow is the title deck, and it's really good.
Excellent.
I'm gonna hit you with the Final Fantasy 13 and just make you relive all that, Gino.
No, please don't make me. Please don't remind me of my time playing that game.
I'm gonna build a Hope deck.
No, no one should build a Hope deck. No, you know, there's actually a Hope card that gets more powerful if there's a mother and a father in play.
Yeah.
But Hope doesn't care if it's his mother or father. It just says type card type mother or card type father. So you can have other mothers and fathers in play. And he's just like, look, any parental guidance, please. I just need an adult.
Yeah.
So one question I get all the time when people are interested in this game or trying to start it is, where do I start? So are there any starter decks or collection building that you recommend for people who are trying to get into the game?
Yeah, so starter decks are actually insanely good in Final Fantasy.
Yeah.
So, and I don't really know too much about Magic starters, but I can tell you when I used to buy Versus starter decks, there would be some cards that were starter only, and most of the time they were crap, like they were garbage. You would kind of pull the starter, and you would actually just not even care about those cards. They would just go straight in your bulk bin.
Yeah.
In Final Fantasy, these starter only cards are usually pretty insane, actually. They usually see play in top tier decks a lot of times. Some of the starter decks even moved on to form its own archetype. That's just insane. If I had to recommend one starter deck to buy if you wanted to get straight into competitive, buy the Final Fantasy 14 starter, because you can literally just sub out 10 to 15 cards and it's an actual competitive deck.
Wow. I didn't know there was one.
Yeah, it's Scions of the Seventh Dawn.
Oh, okay.
It's probably the best tribal in the game. Yeah. And I mean, all of the starters are extremely playable, and then after that, it actually you don't even have to play any legendaries in that deck, and it's competitive.
Wow.
Really?
So.
Yeah, so I got 9 when I started, and that was earlier this year, and 9 seemed pretty solid. Em, you got 13, right?
I got I got 13, and then I just picked up 14 because I've been playing 14 pretty heavily.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'd say you can't really go wrong with any of the starters, and every other set they come up with a starter. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it too, they actually just came out with a 2-player starter deck.
Yeah, that thing's so. I just got it on a whim, and it has Genesis, a playset of Genesis in there, which is maybe the most powerful ice card, one of the most powerful ice cards. You get a playset. You get a playset of the new. I mean, new Furion seems pretty good. The Fire Furion.
Furion, Warrior of Light, new Fire Warrior of Light. You get a playset of Legendary Vivi, which is very good too. You get some Shadow Lords, which are pretty good. It's a really good value. Fat Chocobos in there as well. Those are all legendaries, by the way. So it's and the worth of those cards actually didn't come down when that starter was released because it's kind of hard to find. So if you can find that starter, that's where I would start. And then if you want to be competitive, if you want to be competitive on the cheap, I would buy the 14 one. But every starter is pretty good. You can't go wrong. If you want to learn the game, I would recommend just pick your favorite game of all the starters and buy that one. And just start the game with that.
It seems like maybe the early Opuses, the starters from like Opus 1, Opus 2, just because there were fewer cards, they don't seem to be as powerful. But even still, like you said, some of the starter-only cards, like starter-only Pain, is really good. Yeah,
she still sees tons of play nowadays. Those are definitely on the weaker end. Starter Valifor, as well, as one of the best summons in the game, and that was an Opus 1 starter card.
Oh, yeah. Right.
So, I mean, you still see those cards. And the foils are pretty hard to come by because the foils you can only pull out of packs, and they have to be your foil in the pack. So.
Oh, I didn't even know that they came in packs.
Yep, only the foil versions come in packs of the starter cards, and they're pretty rare. Usually, if you buy a box, you're lucky to get 2 out of a box. 2 foil starters.
Furion. That was my one starter card that I got.
Okay, I was wondering how you pulled a starter out of a pack. I didn't even know that existed. So you've said a few times now legendary. So the rarities of Final Fantasy are what? Common, rare, heroic, and legendary. And in that order of rarity. So and you get. How does it break down in a pack?
So each pack is, I want to say it's 14 cards. It might be 12 cards. I'd have to actually count, to be honest with you. But you're guaranteed at least a legendary or heroic as your last card in your pack. And then you're guaranteed 1 foil, and your foil could be legendary. It could be anything, right? It could be common, it could be legendary. But you're guaranteed 1 foil. There used to be double legend packs, but they seem to have kind of come back on those. You don't see them really anymore in the newer sets. But if you buy an older set, like an older print of an older set, you get lucky. You can get I had one pack, the best pack I've ever had, and I don't think I'll ever have a better pack, was I pulled a foil Genesis and a regular Genesis in one pack.
Oh, wow.
And, that was pretty sweet. So, but they don't really do those anymore, so.
I got a foil Estinian, and then I forget I think I got another legend in that pack, too.
Okay.
But that was the best pack I'd ever opened. And that actually leads me to my next question, which is support for the game, like from Square and competitive. I've been to PAX East, I've been to PAX Unplugged, I've been to some decent-sized conventions with a high trading card focus. And it seems like Square, at PAX East, they do some teaching of the game, but they don't run tournaments for people who have their own decks. How have you found the game support?
So they're getting better. It's definitely something they're still trying to do. We have a rep that is actually really active in the community, and he talks to us a lot. And this year they've just started announcing the new competitive season, and they took a lot of our critiques and stuff, and it looks like they're really taking that to heart and kind of putting that back into the competitive scene. Funny enough, at PAX East, was it in Boston? Was that where you were?
It was in Boston, and I actually asked one of the Square people there who was teaching, hey, There's an entire section of the show floor that has people just playing Magic and other card games. It's like 1/3 of the floor almost. It's a pretty significant portion of space, and there were no Final Fantasy tournaments going on. But if you went to the Square booth, you could just get a demo game, but they didn't have any decks to play against people who had actually constructed their own. And I asked, why are you running any tournaments? Is there any way I could get a game? And they said, we're actually, there's I think a tournament running at a hotel off-site.
I was there.
I was like, I'm not leaving. I came to this show for a reason. I'm not leaving this show floor to go to another tournament someplace else that I can't even find.
Yeah, so it was actually right next to PAX East. It's the hotel that's
awesome.
connected to it.
Oh, wow.
That was it was a Crystal Cup. It was the very first ever North American Crystal Cup was at Boston. I was there. It's basically the equivalent of like a GP in Magic.
Okay, cool.
However, I say the equivalent. It's the Final Fantasy equivalent. It's not that big. Right now we're building up like a big tournament for Final Fantasy is probably like in like the low hundreds. That's big. And I would say if you can get to 50, that's even pretty big. For like a local, or it's definitely still gearing up. It's not anywhere close to what Magic is right now, but I think they're trying and they're getting there, and there's more support, and they're trying to do more stuff, more tournaments, and I think you're gonna see them promote the game more. There's been a lot more cross promotion recently too. Like the Final Fantasy 15 page shared the card out. Noctis was like a buy a box promo. It was a full art Noctis, and they shared that on like the 15 page. They started putting it on their mobile app. In EU, they actually the promotion is pretty insane, but I think they have more money pumped into it over there than we do. So, but it's definitely getting better. We have a lot more official Square tournaments already announced this year.
Are Crystal Cups official Square, or are they organized? Okay.
No, so there's right now we're in preseason, and they have what's called Petite Cups over here, and those are official Square tournaments, but they're not really like. You don't really have a Square rep there. They just kind of provide the prize support. So there's actually one at my local game store that I'll be running on behalf of Square. Or not really on behalf of Square, but Square's allowing us to run it is the better way to say it.
Okay.
So I'll be streaming that. That's February 23rd. And then there's a...
And what Twitch would people be able to
that's
find
my Twitch. So RVA Chronos is my Twitch.
Cool.
So I'll be streaming that on mine. And then... There's Crystal Cups, which they do all the stuff for. They'll call people in to help them stream and commentate and whatnot, but it's on the official Square, Twitch or YouTube usually. And then if you win those, you get to go to the World Championships, which this year's in LA.
Oh, wow.
So they're still kind of announcing all the dates for those right now, but we should have, I think, around 6. Plus there's 2 tournaments at Gen Con. And then, the World Championships at the end of the year. So we actually just had the Worlds back in November. Was the Worlds of last year. So.
And in those high-level competitive tournaments, is it still best of one, or do they vary it up?
So it's weird. In EU and at Worlds, they had a multi-deck format, almost similar to Hearthstone, if you're familiar with that.
Okay. You
don't get to ban or anything like that, but at Worlds, you had to bring 3 decks with no crossover. So, like, if you had 3 copies of a card in one deck, you couldn't have any copies in your other 2 decks. But if you had 2 in one, you could have one in the other. So you could have a play set across your 3 decks, but no more than that. And then you played a 2 out of 3, in your Swiss rounds and in your top cut. But most of the time, the way it works is in Swiss rounds, it's best of 1. And then once you make top cut, whether it be top 16 or top 32, then it becomes 2 out of 3. So.
Okay, interesting. And since there's no mulligans, or there are mulligans, there's no sideboarding, the games must flow pretty quickly, right? It's just strategy changes you can make. You can't change your deck up.
Yeah, the in-between the games is definitely quick. Like, you basically just go right back to shuffle and then get into your game. But I will say, like, a lot of high-level games, there's a lot of thought, right? So, like, turns take a little bit longer, I think. And, the one big thing right now is there's no official judge program. That's definitely a big deal right now.
That was something I was going to ask. Who enforces rules? So
they usually, at the bigger tournaments, they'll fly out people from Hobby Japan, and they act as the head judges. And then generally it's either, judges that have judged other Final Fantasy events or Magic judges a lot of times. And it's still kind of a pain point, but they said this year they're going to announce an official one. Because, as soon as they do it, I'm going to become an official judge as soon as I can. But, right now we don't have that. And so there's no real strict rule set for, slow play, things like that. There's no warning system, really. So it's kind of – sometimes you can run into issues with that, but a lot of times the community is pretty good. And, there's not really a lot of toxicity. And so most people are pretty cool about it. So, they'll ask you to speed up your play or whatever, and judges will ask you as well. But there's no real hard, fast, punishment for it, if that makes sense, right now.
Definitely. So I guess 2 kind of final questions. One, how did you start your community? How do you, as someone who is into the game, if you like it, there aren't that many stores, at least in the U.S., that I found that carry it. And if they do carry it, finding a scene can be hard. So how did you kind of create your own?
So we were lucky in the way that there was a store that carried the product here. And it's a pretty decent-sized store here at Richmond, Virginia. And when I first started coming, it was me and my other friend, Matt, who doesn't really play much anymore. And, like, we would just come, and, like, no one else would show up, and we'd play. And then I got my friend Chris into the game, who is the guy I do the podcast with every week. And we just kind of started promoting our own scene. He would talk to Magic players. We would show them the game. We did a lot of play. It's easy to sell the game to people that really like Final Fantasy and card games. If you can get that combination of a person, generally you can get them to play. I would say if you're trying to build a scene though, you need to appeal to all levels of play, right? Like you need to appeal to your casual player, you need to appeal to your competitive player, and like kind of nurture both scenes while not kind of pushing one of them away. A lot of scenes are going to be pretty small. Like ours, I mean. Sometimes we'll get about 20 players on a weekly. The most I think we've ever had is like 28 on like a Tuesday. But sometimes we only have like 8 people, you know, and we'll fire with that. Just play 8-man Swiss, cut to top 4 or whatever, and then just kind of, you know, cash out. And then the store is really supportive too, but we do a lot of the legwork though. The store helps, you know, obviously they provide the store and the prize support and whatnot, but we kind of plan the events ourselves. We have a community page on Facebook and we kind of push that. And then as far as like getting the support from Square and stuff, we kind of just had to put our name out there. And, you know, we started doing the content until, you know, Square recognized us and they give us like spoilers and stuff to spoil every set now. It's pretty cool. But yeah, it's definitely a lot of work. I definitely say it's hard to find a store, but I would say if you can find one person locally that you can play with and just go to a store and then keep promoting the game, eventually it'll build into something. Even if it's like 8 people at a store playing, I mean, that's enough for me usually to still have fun. And then I would interact with, you know, after you get to that level, just interact with the national community. They're pretty welcoming. You know, share your results. People help with deck lists all the time. So
yeah, and I guess that actually follow up, like with the community being on the smaller side, and you know, people learning how to play and building decks and kind of growing as the community grows. Would you say that formats get solved in this game so far? Because in Magic, a lot of the times by 3, 4, 5 weeks into a format, you'll have like 2 or 3 decks that everyone is pretty certain are the best decks, and there's pretty much no innovation to be had on top of it. Like you'll have, sometimes in the best formats, it'll be like 5, 6 decks, and they'll just be kind of rocks, paper, scissoring each other over and over again for months. But you know that this is kind of the realm of what the good stuff is. But it seems like when I look at tournament results on Final Fantasy, the decks that are coming up out on top, maybe it's a mix of best of one or the mix of the different communities and what cards people are playing and what decks people are into. But it seems like any given tournament, you can see, you know, there will be the quote-unquote meta decks that are doing well, but then there's always just kind of this wild stuff that's also happening. So is there a way of knowing that, like, this is the best deck, everyone should be working off of this, or this card is unplayable, or that sort of stuff?
So there's definitely some unplayable cards. There's some cards that are pretty bad. You'll just pull them and, you know, you can kind of put them in your bin and not think about them again. I'd say a lot of cards, though, there's not a lot of cards where you'll pull it out of a pack and you're just going to be like, that's terrible and we'll never see play. There's a few, but, like, most stuff, at least, like, you'll be like, oh, I can see that being played with this or that. Now, the power level might not be high on it, and you might not ever see it, but there's not a lot of straight garbage cards. To that, though, there's definitely meta decks. There are decks that are winning more than other decks. I'd say right now there's a pretty clear top 3, maybe top 5. That being said, though, I think there's probably like 20-plus decks that could win a tournament right now, even though there are that clear top 3. I think those are the top because, like, they typically will have better matchups, and the player skill also comes into a lot of stuff too, where you see a lot of these results, and I don't think there's the caliber of play everywhere is not equal. Yeah. And so you might see some stuff top that might seem janky. Like sometimes I'll go to a weekly with something kind of janky, and I might top with it, you know. But like at the end of the day, if you ask me honestly if it's better than what, you know, Earth Wind, for example, I'm going to tell you no, you know. And I mean, but that being said, because there's no sideboards and stuff like that, you can't just have access to these like super hard counter cards that you just throw in your deck, then you're able to counter a certain matchup or a certain card. You have to do that through one-ofs kind of in your deck, like your one-ofs are your deck cards. Yep. And that can be hard to do. So if you're playing, you know, a top-tier deck in Earth Wind and you're playing someone that's come up with their own kind of brew that's strong and you're not ready for it, like they can blow you out of the water, right? So that's definitely something you have to think about. It's definitely a lot better for brewers, I think, than most card games right now, and it is extremely balanced in my opinion. That being said, though, you can't go wrong probably taking one of those top 5 decks to a tournament. You're probably going to have more odds of topping than bringing your own personal brew, But there's definitely room for people to bring stuff like that. And I mean, like I'm going to a big tournament next weekend, and I'm not bringing any of the big 5 decks. I'm actually bringing something that I've been working on. So,
oh, excellent. So yeah, as someone who has been brewing Magic decks for almost 15 years now, when I looked at this game and saw how many weird build-arounds and synergies there are, because like backups, if it's a 2-cost backup, you're going to have to play them, right? So if they have any effects that are even marginally useful, you get some utility. Where like in Magic, 1/3 or more of your deck are just things that exist to allow your other cards to do anything at all. Whereas in this game, your backup slots, they matter, Which backups you pick, they should be the right element, but you can decide, sometimes I want something like Archer, which lets you destroy your opponent's backups. Maybe you want something like Eris, where when she comes into play, she activates a backup so that you can kind of keep your tempo up and keep playing things. But they cost the same, and it's really which of these effects is more important to me at this particular moment, and that just means that all 50 cards in your deck are actually live all the time.
Yep.
Whereas in something like Magic, 1/4 of 1/3 or 1/4 of your deck, after the first few turns, you just don't want to see it anymore because it's not useful.
Yeah, and like a rule of thumb that we have too, when like we're deck building or whatever, if it's a backup that costs 2 and has text that's even semi-relevant, it's always going to be somewhat playable, because there might be a situation where the meta calls for that. And so you might swap out a 2-cost backup for, another 2-cost backup. And then there's also going to be 2-cost backups that are just staples that you're just going to see till the end of time or until they start a rotation because they're just that good. Archer is one of those.
Totally. Yeah. So I guess final question from me is, like, what are the meta decks? You said there's like a top 5. If someone is interested in this game and they want to jump straight into competitive, let's say they bought a starter or something and now they're trying to take it to their next level, what are the decks that people are playing and what makes them so special?
Yeah, so I'd say top 1 or the top 2 decks are probably pretty interchangeable, to be honest. You're either going to go with Earthwind, which is more of a control-y style deck. It's based around like this card called Dodaluma, where whenever he takes damage or whenever he's targeted, he puts damage back on something. And then you use Cactuars, which is a monster. It's like an enchantment that taps to deal damage to something, and so you're damaging your own guy to basically remove guys across the board. It's a very efficient deck. It has a lot of search ability, has a lot of ability to bring stuff back from the KO pile, or the break zone is what's called this game. And your backups are very efficient. And it just does a lot of very kind of pseudo unfair things. Is the best way I could put it.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the stronger decks. The other deck that's probably right there with it is Water Wind. And that's kind of based on what we call the YRP engine, which is Riku Pain.
Our listeners are familiar with YRP.
Yeah. So it plays backup backup Riku, and then the Pain that we talked about earlier from the starter deck. And you want to get those out, and then it also plays the new package around Yuri and Chelinka, which is from Crystal Chronicles. And it kind of uses those 2 packages together to just kind of overwhelm the opponent, play a bunch of stuff for free, and keep the opponent locked down. It's more of like on the tempo end, I guess, if I had to put it into a category, but it does a lot of things, to be honest.
Yeah, Yuri's weird because he does everything. Yep. So he is a tempo card when you want him to be a tempo card. He's a card advantage control card when you want that. And if that's not what you need, he just murders your opponent.
Yep. And yeah, so I'd say those are the top 2. After that, it's probably Mono Wind, based around Yuri and Chelinka. I'd say that's the easiest top tier deck to start with. The other 2 decks above it are pretty technical and will take a lot of playtime and a lot of knowledge of how to kind of use the stack and all that stuff. So if you want like a top tier deck to start out with and you have the money to shell out, Mono Wind's probably the better one.
Yeah, I think that's actually worth mentioning. Like, the most expensive card I've seen this entire game, if you're not getting a foil version, is only like $40, which only is, in quotes.
Yep.
But, Magic cards, if something's a staple in Standard, it can get up to $100. That's happened before recently. So for one card, and you need 4 copies of it. In this game, that just doesn't seem to happen yet.
Not yet. So that was definitely an anomaly at first. When I first started playing the game, the most expensive card in the game, non-foil, was $20. And so it's come a little bit from there. Now we're at 40. The most expensive foil in the game that's not a promo or not some kind of exclusive stupid card that you don't need is that same $40 card in foil, and I believe it's somewhere around like $50 to $51 right now. So even
wow, it's not doubled.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It's because foils. The way I understand it, and I don't know exactly how Magic packs work, is you're not guaranteed a foil in a Magic pack, right?
That is true. Yes.
In a Final Fantasy pack, you're guaranteed a foil every time.
Okay.
Also, if you buy a box of product, you're probably going to pull a playset of each common and rare. You're probably going to be short of a few playsets of some heroics, and then you get anywhere from like 9 to 12 legendaries, and 3 of those are usually going to be foil. So usually if you buy about 3 boxes of product, you're going to have a playset of pretty much everything.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that was the case.
Yeah, if you buy a case, which is 6 boxes, obviously, like if you want to go that far, you'll have at least a foil version of each card, almost guaranteed.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it's actually not bad on the wallet, really, for a card game. And I say that like kind of loosely, though, because, Magic, obviously, is a lot more expensive. But there's also a lot more people buying Magic, right? So, but yeah, I mean, yeah, it's pretty expensive. And I say like shell out for the mono win stuff, but the most expensive legendary I think is Diabolos, and he's like gone up to about $19 a copy. And you usually need 3 of that card if you're playing Wind. Actually, every deck that I've just named has 3 of that card in it. So
yeah, Diabolos is insane. That card, when I read it the first time, I was like, did they print that on purpose? Why does it say choose 2?
Yeah, it's pretty nuts. It's almost always free. It's a really insane card.
It's 5 CP, and then it's got 4 effects, like break a forward of cost 5 or more, make a forward, what is it? Make it 1,000 power if it's 4 or less.
Yep.
Activate all forwards you control, activate all backups. So it can be completely free and also break a thing. Like, just to compare, breaking a creature, the cards that do it with no restriction are like Odin, and it costs 7. Diabolos costs 5, and then it also untaps all your backups, so it can be free. So it does the same thing as like 7 cost Odin, but does it for free.
Yep. So the cool
It's
thing is,
savage.
like, if you're looking at those cards, right, like, and you're weighing that, the cool thing about is there's different reasons to run those cards, right? Like, Odin has EX Burst, right? So if you're playing against a Lightning deck, some players run those, some players don't, but you have to be aware that if you're attacking into a Lightning player, if you flip that could set you back extremely far, right? So there's a lot of mindset to that, too. And then, of course, Earth has a card, actually, and that shuts EX Burst off, which is why he's the most expensive card in the game. I mean, he shuts off an entire mechanic, basically.
Yeah, I can't believe that Warrior of Light, or Wool, from Mobius Final Fantasy. I can't believe that the Mobius Final Fantasy cards are some of the strongest cards in this game. As someone who had to play Mobius Final Fantasy for this podcast, and it for a while was we've kept an ongoing ranking of all of the Final Fantasy games that we've had to play for this show. Let me see if I can find our rankings, because they are constantly being updated through only the most scientific of methods. So right now, at the top, we've got 9. Then we've got 10, 7, 8. The Final Fantasy TCG comes in after 8. And then Final Fantasy 1, then 10-2, then Mobius, then 10-2, the last mission, and then at the very bottom is 13. So the fact that Mobius has multiple really powerful cards in this game, this free-to-play thing, it baffles me every time I see it.
Yeah, I mean, and Diabolos is a Mobius card, too, actually.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, so
Diabolos is a Mobius card. The Leviathan from Mobius is really good. The Mobius Ramu is really good. They've made multiple really powerful... They're all modal cards, too.
So, funny enough, the Leviathan and the Ramu are actually... They count as Category 7. I don't know why. Because
Why not?
They're Mobius art, but they actually don't have the Mobius tag on them. But
Oh, really?
yeah, it's weird. I'm not sure why they chose to do that. I guess they really wanted to put more 7 summons in the game for title purposes, and
Okay.
I guess they just wanted to use that art. I'm not sure why. They also do custom art for the game, which is cool every time they do it. Those are always at least heroics or legendaries, but they have art that's specific just to the game. Like the new Bart's was custom. The new Yuri, that's a new art only in the card game. So.
Oh. I really enjoy when they get the Amano arts.
I like the Amano art too, personally, yeah.
And I can't understand why they keep making Final Fantasy 11 cards.
Yeah,
with screenshots from this
we
old
talked
ass
about
game.
That too. Yeah, there's a card called Goomba. It's literally just a screenshot from a town, and we're just like, how did they ever even like put that in the game? But it's in the game. Yeah.
Yeah, Final Fantasy 11 Mog. I look at it and I'm just like, how did this happen? Star Sybil is another really powerful card.
Yep.
That, like, the screenshot is just, it's bad. It's actively bad.
I have a foil playset of that card, and it doesn't look much better.
Weird.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But yeah, I mean, other than that, the only other top 5 decks, I guess, if you want to go back to that, like Mono Water Phacelia is pretty good. That's more of like a combo style deck actually, where you're kind of
messed up.
Yeah, you're setting up the top of your deck and then damaging yourself to clear your opponent's board, and then you swing through with like your little small weedy dudes, or you drop a big guy, you kill something, and then swing through. And then I guess if I had to pick one, like Scions might be top 5. That's probably right there as well. That tribal deck I was telling that you kind of just take out of the starter and make a competitive deck.
Great. So I think that's it. But before we let you go, would you be okay with some rapid fire questions?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Rapid fire time. But before we get started, any last questions you want to ask before we do rapid fires?
So I was just wondering about the community for this game. Like, how would you go about finding other people who play this? Is it is there a forum you can talk to if you wanted to like get onto the national scene? Where do they congregate?
So yeah, primarily Facebook. Actually, we have a North American group, and then there's a fans group. Those are the 2 biggest groups. I'd say join either one of those if you can. Even if you just make a Facebook page just for that, like I would do that, and talk to those guys. A lot of times, if you message in the U.S. group, like, hey, I'm from here, I'm looking for people to play, people will jump on there and they'll show you the nearest stores. There's even like a few links that show you all the stores that carry product and stuff on there as well. So I'd say those are your 2 best bets if you're trying to join the community.
All right, good to know.
Okay. So, rapid fire. What is your favorite FF game?
7.
Great choice. What job, if you had to pick one of the Final Fantasy jobs, which job would you be?
Oh, funny, and this is actually funny. So the tournament I'm going to next Saturday, we all had to pick a job, and that's what's on our badges. So mine is chemist, actually.
Ooh, good choice.
Yeah.
What is your favorite FF character?
Oh, that's tough. Probably Vincent, I guess. I'm a big fan of Vincent.
Yeah, he's got that gun. Moogle or Chocobo?
Moogle.
Excellent. Is Final Fantasy 13 the worst Final Fantasy game?
I'm going to say no, actually.
Ooh. Bold choice. Then what is the worst one?
Sorry, are you talking numbered only? Or any...
Yes, I'm talking numbered only.
Oh, okay, hold on. Yeah, I still would probably say no. I think I'd probably go with 2. Would probably be my least favorite. Or like the worst, I think, over 13.
Well, the science will get to that soon because I'm playing 2 right now, and I have conflicting opinions. We'll see. 2 is a bad game, but man, they're both really bad. So if you had to pick one element to play in the FF TCG going forward, which element would you pick?
Man, that's tough too. I like to play all the elements. Probably
you can only pick one.
I'd probably have to pick fire because that's where a lot of the 7 cards that I like are. So, fire.
All right, excellent. And what is your goal for the year coming up in terms of competition? Do you think you're going to be raking in some tournaments or just going out trying to grow the community? What are your goals for the year?
I want to qualify. Yeah, I want to qualify for Worlds. I want to qualify for the World Championship. That's my goal.
All right, excellent. So thank you so much for your time, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with Adam, you can find his podcast, the RVA Returners. You can find him on Twitter at Kronos411. And you can find the YouTube channel, RVA Returners, that has all the tournaments you guys stream and your podcast there as well, correct?
Yep.
All right, excellent. And if you want to get in touch with this show or have any follow-up questions that you want answered, you can do so at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections, and they work again. Hooray. And deeplistenspodcast at gmail.com. Send in your emails. We like reading them occasionally. Thank you, Em.
Thank you.
And thank you, Adam.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, listeners. Till next time, peace.